Hello and welcome. I'm Miko Matsumura, and I'm a co-founder at Evercoin Exchange, and I'm also a general partner with Gumi Cryptos, an investment fund. I'm here with Amy Wan, who is a legal expert, as well as CEO of SageWise, and Yousuf Babar, who is with Pineapple. So we're here to talk about, are ICOs dead? Because with the recent SEC enforcement action against Paragon and AirFox, there is a lot of hype and people running around being alarmed, really saying that ICOs are dead. And obviously, what's not helping is sort of bear market conditions for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So with that backdrop in mind, I'd love to kick it over to Amy first and ask the question, are ICOs dead?
Sure. I mean, I think definitely a lot of the hype has been deflated, but if I had to put some sort of numbers to it, I would say maybe 85% ICOs are dead. I think most of the ICOs that were launched last year really were securities, but the SEC has been pretty clear about saying, we're not saying that all ICOs are illegal or all ICOs are securities. Um, they've been very strategic about their wording, right? And if you read through the lines, indirectly, what they're basically subtly saying is, the vast majority of ICOs in 2017 and early 2018 really were securities, but there is some space somewhere where there's an ICO that does look like a non-security. It's just more so that, what exactly that sort of ICO token sale looks like um, is a little bit unclear because, primarily what people have been doing is they're issuing these tokens, but really it's just a fundraising effort.
So I guess just a quick follow-up question, Amy, which is, if you are a token issuer, like what should you do? Like what are the good things to do?
Right. Well, I'm not saying this as an advertisement because I don't practice anymore, but I definitely think that people should um, make sure that they retain good legal counsel, particularly a securities attorney. But you'll probably want to also go with a firm that has attorneys that specialize in various other areas of law, tax, ERISA, things of that sort. And, you know, if people are going to go and launch, a token sale that is a security, definitely you want to comply with the laws. And really what you do around that is, for example, if you're doing a Reg D offering, then once your sale reaches a certain milestone, then you would file what's known as a Form D with the SEC, and that's a free filing, and then of course blue sky filings with the states. Now if people are taking the avenue that they are treating their token sale not as a security, then what I would say that they should do is be more proactive as opposed to just kicking back. There's various steps that you can take depending on how like conservative or liberal your legal strategy is that basically solidifies the belief that your token sale is not a security. And that would include, for example, contacting the SEC and FinHub, having discussions with them, making a presentation to them, all the way to, for example, even getting a no action letter. And I've heard of many people who are currently trying to get a no action letter from the SEC, although I don't think the SEC yet has been willing to actually grant one. But there's many steps that you can take, and I have talked to many attorneys, very good securities attorneys who genuinely believe that they do have a client who is whose ICO is not a securities offering. But the general rule of thumb is those clients are few and far between, and really most of these really are securities offerings.
Okay, that's very helpful. And what I'd love to do is kick it over to Yousuf and talk about. So you're actually developing a token sale. So what I'd love to get from you is kind of what are you doing? Like how are you kind of achieving your path specifically? What are the filings that you're planning to do? And what is it about the design that gives you kind of the opinion about your compliance strategies? I'd love to understand kind of specifically what you're planning to do.
Thank you, Miko. So we are designing a token within the US for selling to US-based buyers. By law, the SEC treats that sale as a security that the buyer is investing in. So the clear regulation within US law for raising money from private investors is Regulation D, and it's exemption 506C. So that allows you to raise money from accredited investors and also to advertise the deal to potential investors. So to file for that exemption, one has to fill out something called Form D, which is available online. SEC has made the filing pretty simple by bringing it in a system called EDGAR, which stands for Electronic Data Gathering, Analysis, and Retrieval System. So using this EDGAR system, a company can obtain their central index key. It's like your central PIN number to the EDGAR system. And then that gives you your access codes, and from there on you can start your filing. And so once you have started filing and you are going ahead with it, the main thing to remain compliant obviously is to have a great law firm. But alongside having a great law firm, what I feel is very important is that it's the responsibility of the founder to also be the company's chief compliance officer to make sure that all the filings and all the regulations are being followed as outlined by the SEC and on time. So that's how we are approaching this question of launching a token in the US. And I think it is a great opportunity. And as long as you are compliant and you recognize that those people who are buying your token are not just buyers, but they are investors, and you owe them a huge responsibility through your business.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that that's logical from the perspective of, generating a legal status for your offering. I mean, it sounds to me, I'd love to get Amy's commentary on it, but, it sounds to me like what you're really saying is you're declaring that it is an exempt security, and it is a security. So Amy, I'd love to get your feeling on that approach. And then the question then becomes, how do you then comply with Reg D 506C if that's what you're going to file?
Yeah, sure. So basically, what securities law says is if you are doing a securities offering, then you generally have to register that offering unless you fall under an exemption. And so there's many exemptions out there. One of them is Regulation D, and under Regulation D, there's again multiple things that you can fall under. The most popular being Rule 506, and under 506, there's 506B as in boy, C as in cat. So it basically sounds like what he's doing is so long as he complies with all the Rule 506C laws, then everything should be good.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess from my perspective, what does it take to fit under that regulation? And, the question is, what are the constraint models then? Like once you've made that filing, what is it that you've sort of promised to do and not do?
So do you want me to answer that, Miko? Or
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. It'd be great to get the practitioner perspective.
Sure. So, when one decides that you will file a Form D and seek an exemption in 506C, then there are certain rules that you have to follow. For example, you can only offer to accredited investors. You have to verify those accredited investors. Typically by using like a third-party software like Verify Investor, for example. Then the good part about it is that it has no limits on the amount raised and no limit on how much each investor can invest. So, and then the the good part about 506E compared to 506B, another regulation that we were also considering is that with 506C, you can advertise. Any kind of advertising is allowed: internet, TV, radio, leaflets, while 506B prohibits that. So I think while not declaring if you're an STO or ICO, you don't have to say you're an ICO or STO, as long as you're filling out the SEC's Form D and following the prescription in that law. That's it. Then I think you're relatively safe.
That's terrific. And from the perspective of kind of when you say accredited, you really are talking about kind of full jurisdiction of the SEC, which is really over essentially US persons, right? So in essence, like, you can also then sell and reach out to non-accredited that are non-US persons. Is that in your plan? I just want to toss it back to Yousuf again.
Yes, that is part of our plan, and then you have a different regulation for that called Regulation S. That's where Regulation S comes in for selling to non-US persons as a US company. And so, a combination of that can be, see, our main market and our total focus is presently on the US market. And so that's where we are concentrating, but yes, we have the Regulation S option as well.
Got it. And the Regulation S is another kind of form filing that you would make, and so it's really, you would be filing D and you'd be filing S.
That's correct.
That's great. And what does S require you to do with respect to non-US persons?
So with respect to non-US persons, we still need to check KYC, which is know your customer, and AML, anti-money laundering. Those kind of requirements are still need to be managed through a software. And there is, so that's the main difference that we see at this point.
That all seems pretty orderly. So I guess what I would love to get is, to me, what if you do this then, Amy? What if a path to a well-formed and regulated ICO is you effectively declare whether you feel you are or not, you declare yourself as a security, you then file the exemption Form D 506C, and then you follow those rules. So you basically sell only to accrediteds that are US persons. Non-US persons, then you file Reg S and you comply with the KYC rules associated with Reg S. So my question is that if you follow that path, you're certainly not trying to say you're not a security, and you're certainly not trying to say that you're not regulated by the SEC. And as long as you keep US person unaccredited out, and you have a really strong verification scheme, I'm wondering if that's enough. Like, Amy, what's your interpretation of the laws here?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting thought, the have your cake and eat it too thing, right? And I did think about that a couple months ago. We discussed it briefly in one of the attorney groups that I'm a part of, and basically the conclusion that we came to out of the group was, unfortunately, that you can't really have your cake and eat it too. Mostly because, a couple of things. One is, if you're treating it as a security, then you are telling the SEC, yes, we believe you have jurisdiction over this, and they will treat it as such too. And two, because that actually has very long, ramifications down the road. For example, when you're trading and things like that, right? So you really do, I think, have to choose which camp you want to be a part of when you're initially doing the offering, and make that really clear. And if it is we don't believe we're a security path, that's fine. I think you just have to, be very, you and your legal counsel have to be very comfortable about where you stand around that. And obviously getting assurances or opinion letters or anything would be fantastic. And, hope for the best. But just remember, we talk a lot about the SEC and securities laws in all these panels and conferences and everything, I think the thing that people often forget to talk about is two things. A, the SEC isn't the only regulator, right? There's the IRS. There's, you may be a commodity, for example. So there's other regulators to think about. And B,
Yeah, CFTC, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
And then OFAC for sanctions.
Right.
And then obviously the next one is FinCEN, right, which is AML. But then on top of that, there actually are state regulators, right? And so the
state regulators, yeah. And also the plaintiffs bar, right? And right now you see a ton of lawsuits and class actions against a bunch of ICOs. And the thing I always tell people is, you think that the regulators are tough, but they're not that tough if you cooperate them. It really is the plaintiffs bar that I think people should be afraid of, right? And plaintiffs bar, they don't care. Like they work on contingency. Like they just want their money. So yeah.
Well, I think the thing that's obviously, I'm friends with David Silver, who's probably one of the most prolific lawyers in the class action against cryptocurrency companies, so he's definitely aggressive. And from that perspective, I totally agree with you. And to me, the thing that's interesting is that there is intersection between these parties, right? Because at the end of the day, people who have been kind of jerked around will make complaints to regulators. There may be an opportunity to take filings that come out of a class action suit and potentially submit them to regulators. And so the point being that, I think part of the exercise should be, and again, in a bear market, it's pretty hard to do, but in a way, not make investors like angry, right? I think in a way, like that's part of the recipe, right? Which is, we should really try to keep the investors happy. Because I think if you have happy investors, it's less likely that people will take action on you. Any thoughts? Yousuf, what's your perspective?
Keeping investors happy has two sides. I think one side is the founder side, which should be all about building an organic, genuine investor community of people who you follow and who like your work to an extent, and you've known for a while. And you can't really keep people happy unless they own the initiative in money and a little bit in spirit as well, and where the company's roadmap and disclosures are made responsibly. So that's one side. And the other side is the investor side. And what kind of quality of investors do you have for your early investors? I mean, for example, are your earliest buyers really investors who plan to stick with you for, like, let's say beyond 1 year? Or are you okay about selling tokens to just traders who want to start trading on an exchange as soon as possible? So, and that comes most often at a time when your actual service for which one is issuing a token is going to be barely out of beta. So it's a very sensitive time. And do you actually want a big market fluctuation going on around your coin? So keeping those in view, the 506C regulation is a restricted security, which means that the investors cannot start selling it before a 1 year term. And I think that's maybe a really good thing, because the SEC, I think, cares for founders, and it's a very newborn kind of business, and maybe it wants to protect it from volatility.
That's interesting. Amy, are you still there?
I'm still here.
That's great. Well, so from my perspective, what I'd love to kind of get is really just an understanding of how you think the dynamics would work. I mean, for me, it feels like what Yousuf is providing is a path that, looks compliant. And obviously, to me, doing all of these filings has kind of an overarching concept of don't defraud investors, right? So, I mean, even if you file all these filings and you make sure everyone's accredited, if you flat out defraud them, you're still going into the clink, right? So,
oh, totally.
And so that's the point, right? Which is, at some level, the SEC is really focused on investor protection. And so once you've declared that it is a security, you need to, basically do a lot of disclosure, and you need to make sure that the investors have a clear understanding of what they're getting into. And it might help you to be upfront declaring a lot of risks, right? And saying, here are the risks implicit in you doing this. Although, the class action suit against Tezos may not have, that thing was chock full of risks,
Yeah.
and it still may not have alleviated them from getting any lawsuit. So,
Yeah. I
thoughts?
mean, I think what's going to be really interesting is, really a lot of these things, like we've talked about earlier, really a lot of them are really fundraising schemes, and they really are securities, right? And, I was on Twitter this past weekend, and there was this entire thread about people who were commenting on like SEC stuff and enforcement action stuff, but totally reading the statements the wrong way. And I was just sitting there being like, wow, like the SEC has been saying stuff for over the past year and a half, and people in the crypto community still don't get it, right? And so, what I think is going to be really interesting over the next year or couple years is, I think it's pretty clear that in the vast majority of cases, all these token offerings really are securities, right? But from the whole rhetoric that they've said around Ethereum, they've provided this hint that, hey, if you are decentralized enough, or if you get to some certain point, then your tokens may cease to have their security characteristic. And at what point that is, remains to be determined, right? We don't know. We don't have clear guidance yet. But I think there could be something there where it's like, okay, we're going to go out, we're going to sell these tokens, we're going to treat them as a security, and then hopefully one day we will get to some certain milestone in which it loses its security character, and now it's just a non-security token. I think that could be very interesting.
And I think that the signaling has been clear in the DAO report, which is that it is clear that Ether itself used to be a security on the ICO date, but appears to no longer be one, right? So I think that's the kind of interpretation that's been provided. And I think that that's very interesting, but I want to kind of keep things prescriptive. Yousuf, maybe jump back in here. So what I'd love to do is get your feeling about kind of the path of, once you've raised the money, like how do you see, your obligations, and how do you see, and also kind of like, how do you set expectations in a way that kind of insulates you from any legal complications, legal, including class action, civil litigation, as well as regulatory enforcement action?
Sure, Miko, that's really a very simple pathway here, because the first decision one makes is that, obviously I just want to recap here a little bit, because the impression one gets is that, that we have a chance of today going to the FinHub and working it out so that maybe we are not a security. But for most people, and I think for us, we made a decision that yes, we are going to go with the filing, not without saying. So our pathway to safety is to make the filing really proper, the Form D and all the paperwork that goes into filing a 506c. At the end of the day, it is for investor protection. And so the more information you disclose, the better it is. So disclosures are a main part of it. KYC, knowing your customer, is a huge part of that as well.
Here's a question I have for you, right? Which is, Amy enumerated a whole bunch of regulators that have essentially, jurisdiction. And so the thing that I think, one of the ominous things that somebody mentioned was the possibility that an ICO could be interpreted as a money transmitter. Right. So, if that is indeed the case, then I think there's almost no way to do one in the United States at all. So I guess
right. That's a very important point, Miko, because that is something that we are actually writing right now. That's the only thing that we're actually approaching FinHub for, because we are not a money transmitter, but we do trade airtime as a value transfer. Could that be construed as a money transmitter? And so that's the clarity that we are seeking while filing all of the forms and documentation.
Got it. That's very helpful. And I think, but to me, pedaling back even one step, one of the things that there was an implication of is that that the act of selling tokens at all, regardless of their use, could be interpreted as money transmission. So that especially receiving things like Ether, which is really kind of some form of investment. So I guess to me, I want to throw this over to Amy actually, which is, what is your perspective on that? And, do you think there's merit? Is that a legitimate concern? And if so, what should people be doing?
That's an interesting question. So I will couch this all by saying that when I practiced, I was a securities attorney and not a money transmitter attorney. So that's kind of out of my purview. But, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on the money transmitter stuff, but I hear that there are certain states that are taking more interesting approaches to the money transmitter issue, and that may help things. But again, like maybe this is why when Satoshi published the original Bitcoin white paper that they made themselves anonymous, right? Like they just didn't want to deal with all of this.
That's great. That's a funny way of looking at it. I always kind of assumed that Satoshi did so as a function of a beautiful decentralized design. But maybe Satoshi was really worried about being regulated. Anyhow, do you have
Miko, I have one thought here to share based on what Amy just said. And, the way we are structuring this, just to put the word out there, is that there's a difference between transmission from peer-to-peer transmission from one user to another. And then if they're in a central ecosystem, those can be purchases. So it becomes a marketplace. So when you make purchases, it's very different from peer-to-peer transfers. So if you have a purchase mechanism configured in your strategy, for example, everybody's a member and they're purchasing a service, that to an extent gets covered in that, if I'm able to clearly put that out there.
Wonderful. So here's my thought, and what I would love to do is kind of make a closing comment, and then I would love to kind of open it up to you guys for any closing comment, which is my closing comment is that, Amy said that like ICOs are 80% dead. I would turn it around a bit. The way I would twist it is I would say 80% of ICOs are dead. And the reason why I'm framing it that way is that it feels like if you're taking a path forward, and especially if you have guidance from FinHub, so if you're talking directly to the SEC, if you're making the appropriate filings of exemptions and you're really being very clear with people who are investors, and I want to use that word because they are buying securities, right? You're declaring, so if you're following the path that we're describing, as long as that path does have approval from, the SEC, and as long as it does have kind of the approval of a competent legal professional, your lawyer, right? Then you're in great shape. And so I guess what I'd love to say is that it isn't that ICOs are dead. It's really that defrauding investors is dead. And that flaunting the law and ignoring regulations are dead, right? But if you my closing statement will be if you are following the regulations and getting guidance from the regulator, you're probably on a pretty safe place. And again, if you make your investors angry, the question becomes, did you defraud them? And that question may be sorted out in a court of law. So to me, like, even if you've done everything perfectly, if for whatever reason your investors are very angry about things you did, then you may actually feel some heat regardless. So that's my kind of final word. I'd love to get kind of a first Yousuf, as a practitioner, I'd love to get your kind of final word and reflection on what I said, and then bounce it directly back to Amy and see if she can close this thing up.
Sure. My closing comment here would be that, in the past 1 year, even outside the US jurisdiction, with, countries that were considered very liberal in blockchain, Malta, Gibraltar, many others, are actually coming to regulations. They're formalizing the industry. We are seeing more concern about investors and how an ICO or a business pans out for them. So very, very correctly, it's all about the investor. So in the US, I think what's happening now is that the US regulator is actually waking up to certain realities and working closer with people within the country. Now, I very strongly feel that they need to have a working committee, actually. The next step beyond would probably be to have a working committee of practitioners. And so that the next stage of the regulation can be evolved together in consensus. So I think there's a very major opportunity right here in the US, plus the US market, the US user, the US investor. You don't want to go out and discount all of that. The trade-off is too big for us. And so I think it's a great market as long as you put in a little effort to be number one, compliant, and number two, very sincere with your investors so that they're happy people.
That's wonderful, and definitely consistent with my perspective. So, Amy, you're batting cleanup here, so I'd love to get your reflections on dead or not dead. Sounds like the votes so far are Miko not dead, Yousuf not dead, and obviously we're all very compliant in terms of the way we look at that. But Amy, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think you're smart to reframe it, right? Because everything is always a matter of perspective and definition. I mean, if you are counting ICOs as, things that are scams, then yes, those aren't around anymore. But there still are several token sales that are legitimate, right? If we see ICOs as a legitimate sale of the token, then yeah, they're perfectly still alive. They're just now more so in the form of an STO, I would say. But for the non-security ICO, like I said, I definitely don't think they're dead. And I think there will continue to be a way in the future where, a path forward where you can have a true non-security, pure utility token, even at the initial issuance. It's just that,
Amy, I have to redirect you a little bit, but the path that we've described on this podcast is actually filing an exemption, effectively declaring yourself a security. So you're saying yes, but only if you go pure utility token and you're not, or
No.
What about reg? What about?
Yeah, I'm saying, if you take the framework of it being a security, then absolutely, ICOs are going to be around. They just are STOs, right? If you're taking the framework of them not being a security, then I think there's still something there. It's just extremely hard and rare.
Great. That makes a ton of sense. So, really appreciate, the fine guests that we've had on this podcast, and, really thank you all for listening. If you want to follow, I'm Miko Java on Twitter. And if anyone else wants to give a shout out, my project is evercoin.com. And if you guys want to give a shout out to any of your projects, please go ahead and we'll close it from here. Amy and then Yousuf.
Yeah, sure. So my Twitter handle is Amy Y. Wan on Twitter. I'm also on Medium and all the other social media things. And my company is SageWise. It's just sagewise.io.
Shout out for my company, which is pineapple.world. And my name is Babar, Yousuf. You can reach me at Babar, BABAR, at pineapple.world.
And I guess we'll close it here. Okay, thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you.